Let's go to the Jordanian capital, Amman, and speak to Tahani Mustafa, senior Palestine analyst at the International Crisis Group. Good to see you again, Tahani. Well, last time we spoke, you were mentioning Israel's maximalist demands. Some of those are the disarmament of Gaza, the expulsion of Hamas, being able to maintain security of the enclave forever. Are there any indications, in terms of Steve Witkoff's positivity, that Israel is changing any of its positions?
No, not at all. And it's definitely a time for cautious optimism once again when we hear a lot of hype around a potential breakthrough in a ceasefire. We're still hearing the same sort of narratives around this, which is Israel has rejected the initial proposals, and now we've got the US trying to wordsmith or wordplay around to try and make it more palatable. And really the sticking points here isn't so much Israel reining in on its demands, which it still hasn't really achieved, but more putting the pressure on Hamas to try and ease up on its own demands, and then trying to get Israel to at least ease up on the timeline of events, but really in the way of actually forcing Israel to rein back its campaign, to try and engage in good faith, to try and provide the guarantees needed, never mind even accept at least a modicum of some of the terms that have been put forward. We're not seeing any of that pressure, even by the US's own admission. This is really just as far as the US and Israel are concerned, more about wordplay that's going to make Netanyahu look good to a domestic audience, rather than actually taking anything seriously with regards to these negotiations or conditions being put forward.
Anti-government protesters in Israel are trying to put their own pressure on Benjamin Netanyahu. But just a couple of months ago, Tahani, there was an online poll, and it only asked Jewish Israeli citizens. It found that 82% backed the forced deportation of Gaza's residents out of the enclave. That says a lot in terms of the effectiveness of those anti-government demonstrations, because Netanyahu will look at a poll like that and say it doesn't matter who's protesting against me.
Well, that's right. And there's been a lot of scapegoating around Netanyahu in the way of trying to justify Israel's ongoing onslaught, not just in Gaza, but also in the West Bank, where we're seeing similar images of destruction and displacement. But it's really indicative, those polls, but also the demonstrations themselves. And if you kind of hear the narrative coming out of those demonstrations, it has nothing to do with the onslaught in Gaza, the human suffering on the ground, or the displacement of Palestinians from their own land. It's about getting their hostages back. But in the way of actually, really sort of protesting for anything positive for the human suffering on the ground, we haven't seen that come out of any of these protests. Really, these protests have been centered around getting their hostages back. But Israeli society itself has moved so far to the right. And this isn't just something that started with the 7th of October. This has been, a progression we've seen over the last few years, if not the last decade. So to expect those protests to be able to hold their government to account and to be able to push for a proper, fair, just settlement here, I think we're being incredibly naive.
We've got Germany, France, Canada threatening to sanction Israel. We have the French government hosting an international conference next month. It's believed that possibly at that conference, France will recognize the state of Palestine. Other European countries have done the same in the past few months. Will EU sanctions from EU, former allies, current allies of Israel, make a difference?
Well, it's very unlikely that we're going to see that rhetoric shift to actual tangible policy. And a lot of this is really just coming from domestic pressure rather than any serious sort of attempt to address shifting geographical realities on the ground. It's interesting that, at the time where we've got European states and Canada talking about sanctioning settlers and settler leaders and ministers, they haven't said a word about the shifting geographical realities in the West Bank, where you've literally had Israel over the last 2 months now effectively encaged through wired fences and walls, Palestinian towns that have been subject to some of the worst settler violence in the last few years. You're talking about towns like Turmas Aya, towns like Sinjar. I mean, it's absolutely, insane that we haven't heard a single European leader at a time of advocating for sanctions not mention any of these things, and where the residents themselves feel like this is going to leave them open to massacres if settlers do decide to go in and do what they've been doing over the last couple of years to these towns, destroying property, harming residents. So it's very unlikely that we're going to actually see this. translate into any serious tangible policy, especially given that, we've already kind of seen that in the last few years where we have had European states float around, in rhetoric at least, a lot of these similar sort of proposals that we're seeing come to fruition now, we've not seen them translate into anything substantial. And especially with what we've seen come out of Gaza, I think that should be a lesson that if in the last almost 2 years now, coming up to 2 years, if Western governments haven't thought to rein Israel in, despite the immense level of suffering, it's very unlikely we're going to see them do so now.
Tahani Mustafa, thank you so much for the analysis.